713th contact, Sunday, 16th of December 2018, 13:24 hours. Contact Reports Volume, Issue, 17, Plejadisch-Plejarische Kontaktberichte Block 17, pages, 137 U circumflex 162. Contact number 710 to 722 from November 9, 2018 to August 8, 2019. Translators, DeepL Translator-Auto-Translation, Joseph Darmanin. Date of original translation, Sunday, 18th of April 2021. This is the entire contact report. It is an authorized but unofficial DeepL preliminary English translation and most probably contains errors. Contact persons.
Ptaah. We have been talking about these things for some time now, but I think we should finish this thing later and revisit it and continue to discuss it privately. We know what has come out of it, as well as what will come out of it. But we should now talk again about what happened last week, on the 24th of November, at about 1:15 hours, when I observed the orange object from our kitchen in the north over the horizon, to which you said that it was a Sonaer beamship. I think it would be good if we refreshed and discussed this observation and what you explained, and also put it in writing, because I think it might be relevant for later times.
Which might be why we should start again from your observation.
Of course I can. Good then. On the night of the 23rd of November I worked in the office until after midnight as usual, after which I went over to the kitchen shortly after 1:00 hours, just on the 24th of November. As I looked out of the window towards the north, I saw a large yellow light above the wooded horizon, which was not far away. A little surprised, because I had not observed such a phenomenon before, I first assumed that it might be a new type of spotlight from an approaching aircraft. This is because every night large passenger planes flying in from the north light up their headlights before turning around and flying towards Clinton to land. The big yellow light did not come closer and there was no aircraft noise either. But I could see how the light grew a little bigger and began to pulsate on the one hand and emit weak light waves on the other, so I thought it might be a beamship and tried to clarify this, but was unsuccessful. Then the radiating yellow light suddenly disappeared, to which you later explained to me that it had been a beamship of the Sonaer, who were now also dealing with the matter of the swinging waves and the strange occurrences in my office, etc., and had gained important knowledge in this respect. To mention these again in your words should be necessary, I think. I think it should be, because since it is something we are also talking about in the core group, it should be necessary. However, since this has not been done so far, because as a result of my serious accident and the resulting consequences I can still only write with great difficulty, which is why, according to your instructions, I should also only call up and write down an important conversation report now and then. This matter has not been called up so far, consequently there is no contact conversation report about it.
Then I will explain the following again. The object you observed was a larger flying apparatus of the Sonaer, which is technically equipped with the latest highly sensitive instruments. These are instruments and apparatuses that have been continuously developed over the last 3 years according to the findings of Sonaer and Zephaniah Panich. A large group of more than 300 specialized Sonaer has been involved in this work and is also still busy with it. The knowledge gained by Sonaer and Zephaniah Panich through their investigations into the very strange occurrences in your workroom, although I have also witnessed such strange occurrences myself along with you, as have some core group members in Florina, led to the development of the latest techniques, apparatus and instrumentation with which the Sonaer flying apparatus you observed is now equipped. Both Sonaer and Zephaniah Panich, have been busy for years to clarify all the strange occurrences as well as the disturbances that are harmful to you, which affect your computer work and are becoming more and more intense and have also been occurring at Bernadette's for some time. The latest findings of Yanner and Zafanatbanich, which have been repeatedly made for about 3 years now, have now been made by the association of more than 300 Sonaer specialists, who are engineers, cyberneticists and other scientists in specialist fields of analytical multidimensional vibrational levels, educated as specialists of the highest levels, whom you recently described as geniuses with regard to their specialist fields, have now gained extremely astonishing and important findings which are demonstrable for them and also completely new for us.
Excuse me, but I have a question about this, and it is in relation to analytical multi-dimensional vibrational levels. If I understand correctly, this is somehow a field or science that is analytically related to different dimensions or levels of swinging waves. So I understand it to be an analytics of swinging waves of different frequencies, which occur as oscillation numbers in different frequencies periodically recurring impulsively. This therefore means, so to speak, that by multi-dimensional levels of vibrations, quite succinctly speaking, simply different frequencies are meant, and these are therefore not limited to one single one, which are to be fathomed or analyzed, but which, in my opinion, can also quite simply be called impulses.
I can affirm that as correct.
Aha, good. But then the question of what is behind it. Is it perhaps about researching and analyzing the sectarian swinging waves that are constantly harassing me as an independent of faith and religion in my office with strange occurrences and also in my computer work?
Yes, because the Sonaer can now prove beyond doubt that all the incidents concerning the strange occurrences in your workroom, as well as the interference with your computer work, are caused by the enormous mass of religion-related energetic swinging waves and their self-dynamically acting activities. This fact, however, is not intelligent for believers in religion, as well as for knowledgeable scientists and researchers of any size of mind, reason and intelligence. The earthly sciences, research forces and humanistic psychology are absolutely ignorant with regard to religion-believing energetic swinging waves, their forces and frequencies, as well as with regard to their self-dynamically acting modes of action. The self-dynamic action manifests itself outwardly and can be recognized, made visible and expressed as certain negative, malicious and degenerated thoughts, feelings, actions, deeds and other behaviors. The fact that everything other than what every belief in God and religion supposedly claims to bring about takes place ultimately manifests itself as a malicious and uncontrollable contradiction, not as peace, freedom, justice, love and non-violence etc., but as exactly the opposite, as unpeace, unfreedom, violence and hatred. With regard to what has now been said, I must explain that I have to take up even more and also repeat some things several times, as I also have to enumerate further explanatory terms that can describe everything that is necessary, for which I will cite a number of relevant terms for understanding, as I have learnt them from your extensive use of language and which apply very precisely to what results in earth human beings who believe in God and religion. When the impulses of their inner character break through, I will begin my enumeration with the evil disposition in relation to wickedness, which contains many other low aspects, such as shabbiness, baseness, impudence, wretchedness, and open or deceitful malice and lying. Further, slander is also to be mentioned, which carries abysmal selfishness, self-importance, selfishness, obstinacy, arrogance, hegemonic behavior as well as self-love and egoism, from which also envy and from it deceitfulness, malice, hatred, reprehensibility and revenge behavior arise. which trigger pathological impulses and in the last resort lead to acts of blood, killings, murders, wars and terror activities. Further, I will now also mention other degenerations that arise from the whole of sectarian faith vibrations, which act in their own dynamic and have a malicious effect on earth human beings, because in their allegiance to faith they do not think for themselves and do not make their own decisions and are therefore also without their own opinion with regard to acting freely according to their own responsibility, and this results especially when the believers in God and religion are suggestively incited to enmity and hatred against other human beings, groups and peoples, etc., by religious faith leaders, by any groups, associations, rulers, militaries and governments, and in this respect, there is also the rule that warlike and terrorist acts, deeds and other malicious behavior are demanded, which the believers in God and religion unhesitatingly, obediently and willingly comply with, and they do this by disregarding all humanity, goodness, love, justice and righteousness, without resistance to the orders and demands of the ringleaders in power, and by causing bloodbaths, massacres and destruction through enormous degenerations, as they also commit countless killings, murders and rapes without conscience and spread endless horrors. In addition to all that I have already listed of the degenerate, disastrous human unworthiness which I have named in certain terms, there are many others to be mentioned, such as gall, outrageousness, nastiness, spitefulness, meanness, common danger, deceitfulness and ugliness, despicableness and treacherousness. And in addition to these terms, there must also be mentioned infamy, devilishness, dogness, meanness and insensitivity, meanness, wickedness, lustfulness for war and terror, perfidiousness, vileness and abominableness, etc., which are deeply rooted in the inner character. These are called the
evil,
which are latent in the inner character of the religious believer, and which awaken negative and malignant impulses in certain events and situations, etc., which have a degenerating and malignant effect on the outside and cause much mischief, and this multiple mischief has already developed before primeval times, when in a natural way the life forms quarreled and fought over their food and mating, as has remained completely natural up to the present day in the world of free nature with the majority of many living beings. Only a few species of life forms, as a result of their innate somewhat higher capacity for development, have arrived at modes of behavior by which they have deviated in a slight way from this law of nature and have become more peaceful, less envious of food and less averse to quarreling and fighting. The early life forms, which in course of time ultimately evolved into the human form, were at early times quarreling, fighting and violent among themselves in regard to food and mating, in order to secure for themselves all that they needed. As the development of the human beings as a life form progressed, evolution also brought about the first important factors in the development of reason, whereby the fighting and struggling for food and mating could be carried out more and more successfully and efficiently. This is what happened with the early life forms that developed into Earth human beings and will also be maintained by the present and all future generations of Earth human beings. Consequently, they will, as at all times before, also act today, tomorrow and in the future as the laws of nature dictate, according to which they will also in the future always fight and struggle for their food and mating, if this becomes necessary for their self-preservation through any events, situations and occurrences, etc. But since they possess intellect, reason and intelligence, they apply these values and unvalues to their benefit, according to all their early experiences, which are created in their inner character being and are also latently present today and tomorrow as malignant degenerations. The consequence is, and will always be, if Earth human beings do not make an effort on their own initiative to combat all these degenerations lurking in their inner character being and to dissolve them, that all degenerations and all evils of all kinds unworthy of human beings will go on endlessly into the future with coercion and malignant violence. And the most important reason for this is given by every delusion of every form, because every belief, be it in the form of a delusion of God, a philosophy, ideology or worldview, which corresponds to a delusion of religion, is alien to every reality and truth. Consequently, every faith is not fundamentally grounded in the absolute certainty and irrefutability of factuality, truthfulness and its real authenticity. The living beings of that time, which were still wild beings and not to be equated with ape beings, as Charles Darwin tried to prove as Earth-human ancestors through his fraudulent machinations by working on ape bones with a file, in the course of time fell into all conceivable degenerations, up to killing and murdering. In addition, ever larger groups also led to ever nastier conflicts, which resulted in ever more vicious and degenerating violence among themselves and were fought out early on with primitive objects as fighting implements and weapons. This corresponds to a fact which has occurred not only among the nascent Earth human beings, but throughout the universe on all worlds, and which also continues to take place in this way, for this has been the case everywhere where living beings of all kinds have arisen on any world. But this is also the way in which life forms are constantly evolving throughout the universe, as it will also continue to do in all future time, when the ratio develops in living beings capable of it. The whole thing also applies to all humanoid life forms, to human beings and human-like beings, as well as to life forms which are of a completely different kind from human beings, but all of which are fundamentally peaceful and only become unpeaceful and hostile to each other when the urge for food and mating begins to take effect. This then gives rise to all the evils of quarreling and fighting, up to and including killing, depending on the possibility of evolutionary development in relation to instinctive behavior or a form of intellect. The types of natural instinct for self-preservation, which is naturally given, are then followed. If, however, the ratio develops in a life form, it leads to all kinds of degenerations and evils, if no conscious control is exercised over the developing ratio. Consequently, everything is deposited in the inner developing character being, and from there erupts at every opportunity or situation or impulse, and the more highly developed the ratio function, and with it also the consciousness function, the more perfidiously they can fall into malignant degenerations with regard to thoughts and feelings, actions, deeds and modes of behavior, such as these have in principle already arisen from the beginnings of the becoming of life forms, but which can be devised and implemented even more perfidiously by the ratio. This is also the case with Earth human beings and their thoughts, behavior, actions and deeds, against which, however, they can defend themselves if they make an effort and bring under control their entire malignant, quarrelsome and combative modes of thought, feeling and behavior adopted in the early days of their becoming, in order to become human beings in the truest sense of the term. This, however, is prevented in them by their delusion, which arose in their early days of their process of development into human life forms, as it arises everywhere in the universe from the development of ratiocination in life forms capable of it, through some observation and conceit concerning something which, as a result of false, erroneous assumptions, thoughts and feelings, was considered to be a higher being above all. This led to an unnatural, worshipful behavior and delusion with regard to what was observed and wrongly defined, and from this the whole thing developed into a structure of belief, as is predetermined by the free ability to interpret, not only in Earth human beings from the beginning and time of their existence, but also universally in all human-like and human-unlike life forms, which are capable of a ratio-moderate evolution, are capable of it and develop further in this respect. From this, in the course of time, ever greater conflicts developed between the early Earth human groupings, which then formed themselves into nations and which subsequently built up fighting forces, up to organized militaries equipped with deadly and destructive military means. From time immemorial, conventional wars and bloody terrorism inevitably arose again and again, whereby finally, in modern times, the madness of all the greatest warlike crimes and irresponsibilities of mankind that have ever taken place arose, namely the creation of atomic fission and finally the atomic war crimes, which have far surpassed by far all the terrible atrocities and crimes of all kinds that have taken place up to then and also all other Earth human beings. It will be, however, that these war crimes and irresponsibilities of humanity will also continue to threaten and still bring a great deal of disaster upon Earth human beings. This is because the majority of all rulers, as well as the majority of the peoples in bondage to them, in their obsession with power and inability to recognize, understand, comprehend and fulfill the truly natural creative and its laws, leave everything unconsidered. In this way, however, they criminally violate and act against the natural creative reality and its truth, whereby they keep all mischief rampant and constantly promote it. Thus not only peace, freedom and justice are more and more invalidated, but also every correct administration of justice as well as every possibility of teaching Earth human beings. This is especially true with regard to opposing the false doctrines of faith and religion, which deceive their believers and prevent them from becoming sensible and thinking for themselves, with speeches such as,
God alone will judge,
and
prayers will be heard by God and will help.
This is so that the Earth human beings can learn to direct everything on their own initiative, to think for themselves, to investigate, to decide for themselves and to act on their own responsibility, in order to sort out everything evil and degenerate in their own inner character being and to change it for the better and thus to true human existence. All that which is degenerate and malignant, as I have described and explained it, and which anchored itself in the inner character of all Earth human beings ages ago, is since then unconsciously latent for them, but does not openly appear outwardly and cannot also be directly visible or otherwise comprehensible, without being perceived. It quietly dawns in the inner character being and is depressed by every sectarian, erroneous and confused belief in something better and good, and in particular by every delusion of God and religion which deludes the believing Earth human being that a God, who is in every case imaginary and delusional, will judge and bring about everything good, better, positive and correct, such as peace, freedom, love and justice etc. This confused and foolish belief alone, which impairs the intellect and reason as a result of impaired or fundamentally lacking intelligence, makes it impossible for believers of all kinds, religious or otherwise, to form clear thoughts and to direct them towards the effective, real reality and its sole truth. This fact is founded in an earth humanly invented, insidious, wicked delusion of faith, by which all believers in God and religion are led astray and prevented from exercising their personal responsibility towards their natural, creation just moral development, shaping of life and conduct of life, in that an all-judging imaginary deity is made to appear to them through delusions of faith. Natural creative moral development is understood to be those processes that lead to the internalization of natural creative norms and values, whereby these rules are then also to be adhered to in every situation that arises, even when there is a temptation to break them or resistance to them is great, tempting and there is also no fear of punishment. In principle, since time immemorial, everything degenerate and malignant in Earth human beings has lurked in the inner being of character, in order to break through to the outside at the right time through some event, situation or profound thought emotional impulse, and to wreak havoc and destruction. The erroneous religious teachings and the delusion of faith in Earth human beings are not broken as a result of the unreasonableness caused by faith, but are constantly strengthened to the contrary, misleadingly, by lies and deceit. This is done by preachers of all religions, who, by means of lies and fanciful stories, make the believers in the delusion of God believe in an allegedly all-good God, a Holy Spirit or some saint, through whom the abysmal degeneracy and evil in the inner character of earth human beings can be changed into something better, good and positive, if he, God, the Holy Spirit or saint, etc., is only unquestioningly, piously and positively changed, is only implored unquestioningly, piously and submissively humbly, believed in and worshipped with full devotion. The reality and truth is that there never was an omnipotent God who would have created worlds, celestial bodies, living beings and the universe, for such a God, who never existed and never will exist, corresponds to a mad, confused imagination and delusional conceits of beings who were and are human-like and non-human. Deities only exist among earth human beings and other like or similar life forms who call themselves God and elevate themselves to deities in order to elevate themselves above the masses of their populations and to megalomaniacally want to be something special and higher. In this way, the same phenomenon arises as with rulers and the rich, who believe themselves to be of greater value and above the normal population if they have many material goods and financial resources or carry titles such as president, clergyman, doctor, professor, king, leader or emperor, etc. But with regard to God Creator, it is undoubtedly certain that in truth only the creation universal consciousness was and is the creation of all existence, which holds everything in itself, created, exists, evolves and creates all energies and their powers, and before this all time for the God delusion believers incomprehensible and immeasurable greatness creation, the earth human beings with their deviant God delusion do not shrink from denying it, but raise above it and all its existence imaginary deities, which they worship, implore and thereby humiliate and deny themselves as independent life-form human beings. In their pathological delusion of God, they implement their sectarian delusion of lies and deceit in such a way that they deny the truthful creation of universal consciousness. And this is done by the God-believing earth human beings of all religions and their sects, who worship and glorify an imaginary God Creator as the author of all existence. This is also the case with all those earth human beings who adhere to philosophies, ideologies, worldviews, atheism and other confessions, points of view, meanings and assumptions which effectively correspond to nothing other than beliefs and thus imaginations, which, however, have nothing to do with the real reality and incontrovertible truth of the existence of creation universal consciousness, because all their thoughts, suppositions and assumptions are not based on effective reality and its only truth, but on erroneous, confused and faith-based hypotheses. And the fact is that various philosophies, ideologies, worldviews and other creeds are in some way faith-based on a deity and are therefore unreal and offer no possibility whatsoever of finding any way to effective reality and truth, but that this has to be done solely by earth human beings, each one for himself alone. Moreover consciously and very laboriously through his own initiative, as you teach this as a result of your mission and as you also convey it to earth human beings through the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. But earth human beings' delusion of God and religious belief of every kind prevent them, as believers in God and religion, from being able to perceive reality and its real truth, or, as a result of the fear of divine punishment persuaded into them by the misguided teachings of religion, from daring to turn away from their allegiance to faith, due to the fundamentally false religious misguided teachings. They are indeed beings who are actually responsible for the delusion suggested to them by religious representatives, because they have fallen prey to it as a result of ignorance and misguidance, but they cannot be condemned for this error and cannot be made liable to prosecution, and this is so because every learning in every respect, and thus also in relation to effective reality and its real truth, involves an error that must be recognized, considered, analyzed and remedied, by which only the reality and its truth can be followed. It is precisely this creative process of gaining knowledge, following it and gaining the correctness of life that you teach, but through the religious delusion, which is as a rule already thoughtlessly imposed and implanted in earth human beings as children by their parents and relatives, and then also irresponsibly by their religious representatives, they become helpless, obedient and self-denying beings with regard to their self-thinking, their self-determination, self-decision and their self-action in complete self-responsibility, due to the delusion of God and religion suggested to them, as well as the fear of divine punishment persuaded into them if they turn away from their faith. They are not able to recognize and therefore not able to understand the effective reality and truth. Consequently, they also do not make an effort to question the delusion of faith and the religious lie suggested to them. Therefore, in terms of their faith, they are also confusedly oriented towards placing their imaginary God and his alleged actions and work, as well as his alleged decisions, in the foreground in all things, in a confused and pathologically believing false hope.
God will sort it out.
Because the majority of earth human beings are delusional about God and religion, they also do not know that these regimes, which burst forth from the inner depths of the personalities of the believers in God and religion, inevitably lead to correspondingly degenerate thoughts, feelings, actions and deeds, as a result of which countless degenerations and monstrosities in contempt of life and human beings take place throughout the world, which make a mockery of any description. All earthly scientists and researchers have neither an inkling nor any knowledge of the vibrations of faith which, through their self-dynamic activity, have brought terrible disaster upon earth human beings since time immemorial. Although this also continues to happen unabated, neither the majority of the general believers in God and the delusion of religion, nor the scientists and researchers, who as a rule are also afflicted by the sectarianism of faith, are able to grasp the reality and truth of the swinging waves of the delusion of faith and their self-dynamic activities through their intellect, nor are they able to recognize them through sensual perception. Consequently, they are absolutely ignorant in this respect, for whom on the one hand everything is inexplicable and incomprehensible, but which on the other hand, in their narrow-mindedness and arrogance, drives them to reject and doubt the correctness and truth of the effective existence of the dangerous religious delusional vibrations. This is precisely due to their ignorance of the element of faith vibration, which is completely alien and unknown to them as an element of research, and all this is the reason why you should spread widely among earth human beings all that I am explaining in this respect today. Although you must be clearly aware from the outset that you are therefore again calling adversaries onto the scene through unreason, hatred and know-it-all attitude, and as always, they will also call you a fraud, a liar, a charlatan, a false prophet, an unbeliever, a heretic, and in many other malicious ways, and threaten you. This, however, will be as inevitable as all attacks of every kind and nature, as they have always appeared, for the power of the delusions of faith and their self-dynamic activities seduce all those unrighteous believers in God and religion who are unable to exercise any control over themselves and who, as a result of their faith, suffer from a lack of use of intellect, reason and intelligence, and this will cause them to once again turn against you and against the spreading of the truth and will try to harm you, to undermine the truth and not let it reach the consciousness of earth human beings.
You really do not give me much pleasure, dear friend, for I can vividly imagine what may result if I spread your speech throughout the world. It will also be of no use to me that I have no personal objection to the believers in God and religion as human beings. I always behave correctly towards them and therefore do not attack them because of their delusion, just as I would never speak to them about their faith, because their imagination is their personal matter alone. What I do is only to openly write, speak and spread the truth with regard to the pathological religious delusions or the belief in God and religion, precisely what is at stake in every belief in God and every religious belief. But this is always in connection with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and thus with the mission that is to be spread and fulfilled. The fact of the matter is that it must be said and made clear that everything that has occurred in all peoples since time immemorial through degenerate and malicious machinations, such as killing, murder, wars and terrorism, criminality, etc., as well as through crimes of all imaginable kinds, is also occurring at present or in the present time worldwide in general among all existing peoples, and is also being carried into the future in equal measure. The indisputable fact is that all delusions of God, and thus all delusions of religious faith, which also unites all those sects, philosophies, ideologies and worldviews, etc., which are oriented towards an assumption of and belief in a higher might, have always brought the most evil calamities upon the humanity of the earth, and are also doing so at present and continue to do so. And in such a horrible and inhuman way, as everything completely degenerate in human terms was done by the Inquisition, as also by the 3 world wars and all other wars of all kinds, which were already commonplace in ancient times among all peoples, so it continues unchecked, and worse the greater the overpopulation becomes. The delusion of God, or rather the delusion of religion of all believers, contributes the most to the whole in terms of discord, lack of freedom, injustice, lack of understanding, unreason, hatred, murder and manslaughter, strife, war, addictions, vice, criminality and crime, etc. This is also the case with all other religions. But this is also the case with all other religious, atheistic, philosophical, military, ideological, hegemonic and worldly delusions of faith. All forms of faith of any kind are rejecting of the real existing reality and its incontrovertible truth. Consequently the whole is not perceived, and in its all-time presentness is in no way recognized and also not understood. All forms of delusion of earthlings of all ages, of both sexes and of all professions, also regardless of whether they are rich or poor, prevent all rational and rational thinking and the conscious perception, grasping, understanding and the following, acting and implementing of all necessities in relation to the real reality and the given and unchangeable truth that exists only in this reality. In addition, all beliefs of any kind prevent any real and truthful knowledge in relation to the fact that it is also the constantly rapidly growing and ever more destructive overpopulation that, through its reality and truth disregarding machinations of every conceivable kind, does not allow any insight to arise in the believing earthlings with regard to the reality of reality and its truth. Thus also not with regard to the actual terrible, destructive and murderous war, terror and other life-despising world events. Thus, it is not perceived, not recognized and not understood that overpopulation alone is to blame for all the catastrophes and destructions raging around the world, due to the degenerate machinations of all kinds that it carries out and continues to push forward. All believers in God and religion, as well as all believers in philosophies, politics, ideologies, atheism, worldviews and other core convictions of all kinds, are without exception more or less addicted to a profound sectarianism, as are all other believers of all kinds. It is irrelevant whether they are simple believers in imagination or obedient believers in suggestion, or whether they are simply brain amputees who have unthinkingly committed themselves as unquestioning followers of any faith. This, however, refers to the majority of Earth human beings who close their eyes and senses to all visible and indisputable reality, its truth and everything that is undoubtedly effective from it, and who unthinkingly endorse everything that is steeped in delusion without thinking about it realistically. And this is so because, as a result of his laziness, indifference, carelessness and lack of interest, any initiative of his own towards the perception of real reality and truth and its investigation is blunted as a result of influences of faith, which make him believe that his faith in God and God will regulate and judge everything. And this is only one of the reasons why people of all kinds who are addicted to faith disregard reality and its truth and only live mentally and self-referentially into the day and night and can use neither reason, rationality nor intelligence. It is also to be noted that the majority of all believers of all persuasions suffer from a deficient or even completely absent ability to think logically. In this respect, it is irrelevant whether these believers in God are simple, ignorant and not particularly educated people, or academic title wielders who live under the delusion that with an academic degree as a doctor, etc., or as a president, professor, general, chancellor, head of state or whatever, they must elevate themselves above the common citizenry and are worth more than them. In their delusion of faith, however, they are all more or less equally infatuated with their faith, and are in bondage to every religious doctrine, lie and deception, believing and willfully surrendering to it, whereby they take everything that corresponds to their delusion of faith at face value, imagining it to be fact and vehemently advocating and defending it to the point of quarreling, enmity, blazing hatred, murder, manslaughter, war and malicious terrorism. The whole thing with the delusion of God and the delusion of religion, as with every other faith, has many evil sides, because everything does not simply remain in the earthlings themselves, who are afflicted with the delusion of faith, but it leads them during the time of their delusion in such a way into error and into sectarian, slave-like dependence on the delusion of faith that they also influence their fellow human beings by recruiting followers. In this way, faithfulness is promoted throughout the world, especially among children by parents, siblings and relatives, as well as by schools, institutions, missionaries and highly sectarian female and male lay preachers and soul catchers on television and at public soul-catching events. In this respect, not only irresponsible bare sectarians are up to mischief on the internet and on television, such as the faith-delusional sect fanatic Joyce Meyer and her followers on the Max channel, etc., but also individual terrorists and small terror cells of various faiths. Dictatorial and religiously insane state powers, such as Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, etc., also wreak havoc and justify everything with their insane belief in God, as is also the case with large terrorist organizations such as IS or Islamist State. And everything has always taken place in the name of a religious belief and under the alleged will and protection of a god, clergy or field clergy, whereby murder, torture, manslaughter, robbery, rape, slavery, servitude and war with jubilant cries were and are in the foreground in all states, which early on and up to the present time made use of the God delusion and employed it for the purpose of wars of faith, religion and sectarian wars. The God delusion has always served, and this is still the case today, to animate the war servants, soldiers and the peoples for murder and manslaughter in the name of God and his protection against neighboring countries, enemies and people of other faiths, etc. Therefore, delusional faith in God and the corresponding delusional religions and sects were and are not only a means of propaganda, but specifically a means for lying, deceitful religious sectarian machinations and promises and war, as well as also a way of coercion to force people of other faiths into the political and religious dependency of the victors through fighting and bloodshed. In addition to all the murderous, subjugating, coercive and warlike machinations that arose out of the delusion of God and religion, arose thousands of years ago and have since brought and continue to bring endless misery, suffering, hardship and disaster to the whole earth and its humanity, there have existed and continue to exist other malignant forces of the same nature. So, just as from time immemorial the delusional believers in God practiced wars of faith and religion, and always in accordance with their delusional belief in God, so did others, namely believers in philosophies, ideologies and worldviews, etc., as was also the case with various state powers and is also still the case today. The belief in God's delusion therefore also served and still serves the warring states to motivate their own military and people, especially the soldiers who are called upon to fight and who participate by virtue of correspondingly compulsory state laws. The personal sacrifice of one's own death through the act of war into which the soldiers and peoples are forced is usually equated with a religious sacrifice and thus as an adjunct to the belief in God, with religious benefits being promised to the combatants in particular. The fact is that throughout the ages, warmongering irresponsible state powers and their slimy accomplices, namely religious bosses and other slimy delusional rabble, have expected a greater willingness on the part of soldiers and peoples who believe in God's delusion to fight and wage war. In addition to this, the willingness and acceptance of material losses is demanded from the war and terror inciting state powers and the military leadership, such as first and foremost material disadvantages in relation to a drastic shortage of food and other essentials, etc. but also the loss of one's own houses, the loss of the right to live, 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 but also the loss of one's own houses, possessions, land and property, as well as horrendous increases in levies for war costs and also higher taxes. And all this has always been the case, so also with the Christian crusades, crusaders and with all the criminal religious wars in various countries. Also to be mentioned are the bloody battles for God and Islam, jihad, along with many other religious massacres, as well as such degenerations in Switzerland, such as the two Kappel wars, of which I still know the following from my school days with regard to Swiss history and have also read upon some of it. The first and second Kappel wars in Switzerland were wars between Reformed evangelical, Protestant, and Catholic delusional believers, which means that these armed conflicts were nothing other than delusions of faith and religious wars between two different Christian delusions of faith, which arose as a result of different delusions of faith, various rituals and cult acts as well as practices with regard to the leadership and behavior of the religious leaders and their way of life, etc.
Explanation of the terms Protestant and Evangelical. The term Protestant refers to the two large Christian churches, but this was not always the case, because the term Protestant was already used before the Reformation, whereby it originally meant concerning the gospel or according to the gospel, and therefore Martin Luther also spoke of Protestant in this sense and did not mean the denomination of a particular church.
The term Protestant or Protestants can be traced back to the protestation at the Diet of Speyer in 1529, when the Protestant estates protested against the repeal of an older Diet resolution that promised legal security in the German Empire to those countries where the Reformation had been introduced. whereby the protesting estates invoked the freedom of faith of the individual believer. The First Kappel War took place in 1529 between Reformed Protestant and Catholic places, whereby the starting point of this war between the old and new faith Christians of various places in the Confederation was a religious dispute that was fundamentally based on the famous 95 Theses of Martin Luther, a monk and vicar general of the Augustinian hermits, and which gave rise to the Reformation and the division of Christianity. This was after Luther in 1517 denounced publicly and among the clergy the common practices concerning the Roman Catholic Church and especially its sale of indulgences, which was based on the fact that indulgences could be bought from the Catholic Church by God-believing earthlings, through which the faithful could supposedly buy themselves free of their sins. He called the Pope a hypocrite and also denounced the fact that Catholic priests gave out or sold forgiveness of sins and grace for sins in small bites, granting absolution or absolution from sins depending on how much a believer had paid beforehand. Luther rebelled against this and stressed that a Christian should not be judged by his performance of a financial indulgence, because this did not correspond to Christian freedom, etc., and furthermore, no special works had to be performed in order to attain beatitude, which in Catholicism is fantasized and lied about as perfection in the kingdom of God and eternal contemplation of God. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, a thesis corresponds to an assuring judgment, which can also be interpreted as conjecture, speculation, assumption or hypothesis, as poking around in the fog, as well as an assertion that serves as a starting point for further argumentation, are said to have been written by him at 12 o'clock noon on the 31st of October 1517. However, this does not correspond to the actual truth, but to a stupid conspiracy theory that was invented by a fanatically delusional Luther follower for the purpose of the great Luther courage, in order to give Luther a high nimbus or a special reputation and glamorous fame and thereby also to elevate his reformation. This story sounds really good, but the thing about the nailing of the 95 Theses to the door of the castle church is not true, because their whole thing is effectively a lie and only corresponds to a fairy tale, with which the people were to be made to believe that the criticism raised by Martin Luther against the Pope and the Catholic Church in general was not only brought to the people orally, but also in writing, whereby, what a contradiction! The common people at that time were still largely ignorant of reading and writing. What is clear, however, is that the alleged nailing of the 95 Theses to the castle church door by Luther never took place and that this has been clearly clarified, although nothing needs to be said about how and why. The demand of Martin Luther, the Augustinian monk from Wittenberg, that the church must be renewed, as well as his criticism of the Pope, the Catholic Church and the sale of indulgences, etc. He starts with the clergy, and thus also his open accusation that the Pope needed vast amounts of money for his dissolute life in the Vatican, which Martin Luther insulted as a stronghold of anti-Christianity and therefore cultivated the sale of indulgences in a particularly profitable way. He did this by instructing the Catholic priesthood to sell indulgences in a stricter manner to the delusional, stupid Catholic Christian people, so that His Highest Catholic Eminence, Pope Leo X.
Wikipedia, Pope Leo X, born as Giovanni de' Medici, 11th of December 1475 in Florence, 1st of December 1521 in Rome,
could live in glory and pleasure, and indulge in his costly feasts, etc., and fornication. A well-known fact, as it was also common to other popes before him and also to various successors after him, whereby in this respect the whole thing also applied and still applies to various types of cardinals and simple clergy and many sad clerical figures or consecrated clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. And the whole thing in this respect is not only related to papal, cardinal and spiritual clerical fornication with willing prostitutes bought for this purpose, but the Vatican also does not let itself down in terms of profits, this apart from the exploitation of the faithful, because it also furnishes its financial assets with brothels. But that is not all, because pedophilia and also the sexual abuse of children and adolescents is very widespread worldwide, especially among the Roman Catholic clergy, from the lowest to the highest. And all this has been happening since the time when about 2000 years ago the Herald's Manual taught the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life in Palestine, which his disciples and people made into a basic religion as a result of misunderstanding and misinterpretation, from which the Christian delusion and thus ultimately the entire Christian God delusion and religion delusion emerged, which today comprise about 2.3 billion God delusion believers. This had to be made clear once, but now the religious delusion conflict of the two Kappel wars is to be elaborated a little, because I digressed from it because of Martin Luther. The conflict or First Kappler War began in 1529, but ended without actual fighting, instead with a reconciliation dinner near the village of Kappel am Albis in the canton of Zurich, where a milk soup was made that was recorded in the Swiss Chronicle as Kappler Milchsuppe. Kappel am Albis was already inhabited in the Bronze Age and later there was also a Roman estate there. But there is certainly something to be found on Wikipedia on the internet regarding this place, which I will add to my explanations when I have found something.
Wikipedia, Kappel am Albis, officially called Kappel until 1911, is a political municipality in the district of Fulton, also known as Ramt or Sauerland, of the canton of Zurich in Switzerland. Kappel lies on the southwestern slope of the Albis south of Horsen im Jonental. In addition to Kappel itself, the districts of Hauptikon and Uerslichen also belong to the municipality. The neighboring municipalities are Nonau, Mattmannstetten, Referswil and Horsen am Albis in Canton Zurich and Bar and Steinhausen in Canton Zug. In 1529, the Zurich reformer Huldrych Zwingli allied himself with the Protestant Constance to form the Christian Burgrecht. This was an alliance led by Zurich and directed against Catholicism. Firstly, Austria was in the firing line, and secondly, the Catholic inner Swiss towns of Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, Zug and Lucerne.
But now I want to explain the following: milk soup, that is a term I must explain. Milk soup consists mainly of boiled, sweet or salty spiced milk, which is poured hot over pieces of bread cut into small pieces and then spooned out and eaten. Nowadays, if milk soup is still made at all, white bread is used, which is poured over the spiced hot milk, although other variations are also common nowadays, such as prunes, flour, oatmeal, dumplings or pieces of dough being poured over the milk instead of the bread, or being served separately. However, as far as the Kappler Wars are concerned, I remember the following from my school days, and I also recently took up the Kappler Wars in the kitchen and read up on them, thus refreshing my knowledge. The 5 inner places founded the Christian Union as a countermeasure with Austria. At the center of the religious dispute were the Prince Abbey of Streatgallen and the common dominions, especially Thurgau. The reformer Ulrich Zwingli.
Wikipedia. Ulrich Zwingli was born to Johann Ulrich Zwingli, 1454–1513, a farmer and bailiff, and Margaretha Brumman, c. 1458–1519, widowed Melin, who was Zwingli's second wife, as his parents' third child. His birthplace is now a museum.
Wanted to counteract the Catholic counter-alliance by a military strike and deprive it of its foundations. which is why he repeatedly quarreled with the hostile Catholics and also sought a reason for war in order to be able to put his evil warlike plan of attack against the Catholics into action. Then, in May 1528, the people of Zurich had a Catholic sergeant executed in Thurgau, after which the people of Schwyz burnt the reformed pastor Jacob Kaiser at the stake a year later. In 1529, probably at the beginning of June, a bailiff from Unterwald was to be appointed in the free offices, but Bern and Zurich tried to prevent him from taking office. As a result, on the 6th of June 1529, the Zurichers occupied the bridgeheads in Bremgarten and also Malingen, as well as parts of the Streetgallen countryside, but also some of Thurgau. Then Zwingli marched up with the main force of the Zurichers at Kappel am Elbeis, who were also joined by the Bernese troops, who naturally followed the Zurichers. Just one day after the occupation of the bridgehead and the other occupations, on the 7th of June, the neutral towns attempted to mediate between the hostile Protestant and Catholic quarrelsome and warmongering divine illusionists and to bring about peace, but this was futile, for on the 9th of June 1529 the intransigent, quarrelsome and Protestant delusional Zurichers declared war on the 5 Old Believers and Roman Catholics. But then, through the mediation of the Glarner Landammen Hansebli, a bloody confrontation was prevented and the first Kappler Landfried was concluded without a fight, and it was agreed that, according to a majority decision, each municipality and all its citizens were allowed to adopt and practice the old or new faith at their own discretion, because parity or equality and equality with regard to faith and religion was achieved. This piece of equality was then sealed with a reconciliation dinner, the Kappler Milchsuppe. The peace of equality negotiated in 1529 between the Protestant and Catholic believers did not last forever, however, because the religious conflict broke out again in 1531, leading to a second Kappler War. This was a continuation, so to speak, because no first Kappel War had taken place and reformer Ulrich Zwingli was therefore pissed off and could not satisfy his God-belief-driven war addiction. So in 1531, a second Kappler War was announced as a continuation, because a first Kappler War in 1529 was ended without fighting by the Kappler Land Peace, which, however, did not suit Ulrich Zwingli, who was delusional about God and addicted to fighting, as Sforth explained to me, who at that time as a young man observed all the events and occurrences on the spot, witnessed them and then also described them to me in minute detail. The 2 Kappel Wars were the first religious wars in Europe, instigated by the Protestant Reformed cantons, especially the Zurich cantons, which played the most important role in the front line. In all of this, however, according to Sforth's explanation, the fanatical, faith-obsessed reformer Ulrich Zwingli played the main role as leader and downright ringleader. The God-believing citizens were thus led by a sectarian fanatical delusional leader and under his leadership against the 5 inner Catholic mountain cantons, whereby a grain embargo imposed against central Switzerland played an essential role, which of course originated in Zurich. This, as in the Old Zurich War or also Toggenburg War of Succession some 90 years earlier, which lasted from 2nd of November 1440 to 12th of June 1446 and was a warlike conflict between Zurich and the rest of the 7th largest confederation, which ultimately only really ended in 1450. The whole war took on a super-regional dimension through Zurich's alliance with King Frederick III of Habsburg. The agreements of the First Kappel Land Peace thus did not last long, although developments had a significant influence in the empire. The decisions of the Augsburg Diet in particular increased the distrust between the Catholic and Reformed parties in Switzerland, with interference in the religious relations of the opposing territories reinforcing this attitude. The Rik was also interested in gaining territory, which is why the latter was naturally accused of trying to conquer new territories by stealing land. When the inner places, which were Catholic, were defeated in the so-called Mussakrig.
Wikipedia, the Mussakrig, named after Musso Castle, between the Free State of the Three Confederations and the Duchy of Milan, lasted from 1525 to 1526, First Mussakrig 1525-26, Second Mussakrig 1531.
The war-addicted and God-believing the Rik reformers Zwingli also stepped up urgently to solve the problem in this matter, too, by taking up arms. Naturally, the places allied in the Christian Burgeract again imposed a food embargo on the inner places, which led to them declaring war on Zurich on the 9th of October 1531. Then it happened that the isolated and badly led Zurichers suffered a huge defeat at the Battle of Kappel, for they suffered a defeat on the 11th of October 1531 because they received no help from the Bernese and waited in vain for their timely support, and also lost their warmongering and delusional leader Ulrich Zwingli, who was killed in this battle. 13 days later, on the 24th of October 1531, the battle took place at Gubbel, a hill in the municipality of Menzingen in the canton of Zug, where the war was finally decided in favor of the Catholic places and peace negotiations were then also started. So the result was that a second Kappler War ended with peace negotiations, just as a second Kappler land peace came about and the further spread of the Reformation in German-speaking Switzerland came to an end. Now, however, it is necessary that I add the following with regard to the adolescents and youths who become burning fanatics of faith and thus enemies of reality and truth, who cause wars and acts of terror, unrest, unfreedom, injustice, disaster and many kinds of catastrophes all over the world through their faith burdens and their delusion of faith. And all the setbacks in all kinds of areas that are becoming more and more frequent as a result of the earthlings' belief in God and religion, as well as visitations in relation to vices, addictions, desires and degenerations of the worst kind in many kinds of relationships, such as innumerable family breakups, marital violence, family murders, family dramas, relationship murders, spouse rape and sexual child abuse by their own family members, juveniles, as well as adult pedophiles, especially numerous by Catholic clergy from the simple priest up to the Pope, are becoming more and more prevalent. Also countless disasters, multiple failures of humanity towards people of other faiths as a result of their religious racist delusion, as well as a failure in terms of humanity. But other disasters are also spreading more and more, such as deceit, fraud and also misfortunes and strokes of fate, as well as unspeakable hunger and hardship. Likewise, the deepest abysses of contempt increase in human beings, and misfortunes of many kinds, slaps, emergencies, immense misery, malignant dissents and dissolutions with regard to factors of justice that are contemptuous of life and human beings, but also plagues and destructions of the ecosystems, the atmosphere and the climate. In general, there are more and more devastating destructions, and jobs events of all kinds, etc., etc., are becoming commonplace and are becoming more and more prevalent in relation to the ever-increasing overpopulation. This is equally true with regard to the unstoppable, rapid and catastrophically mass increase in the delusion of faith in God and religion, which is also becoming more and more unstoppable in relation to the number of more than 100 million new earthlings born every year. And this insane, confused and unrealistic and untruthful delusion of God has for many decades been affecting more and more juveniles worldwide, who are being suggestively influenced and persuaded, seduced, driven and misled into believing in God and religion, especially by those wearing robes, gowns, regalia and other religious garments. And it is to be said that in this respect it is especially the Protestant and Catholic female and male God belief sugsters and religion belief sugsters of Christianity and its sects who mainly work in an unscrupulous manner and drive the juveniles to God delusion and religion delusion by persuading them and convincing them with lies, deceit and evil sectarian fantasy stories. And thus they make the young human beings of the earth into slaves of faith, undermine their own thinking, decision-making and the working out of their own opinions that are true to reality and truth, just as their sense of effective reality and truth is also destroyed by the suggestively crammed-in belief in God. So these soul catchers, also those who are of the same or similar caliber with regard to all other God delusionists of all faith delusion religions that exist on earth and carry out their faith delusion mischief, are probably the very worst, most conscienceless and most despicable faith delusion propagation sugsters and, moreover, obviously also the most work-shy elements on earth. It remains to be explained that the helpers of God who, as hypocritical seducers, drive human beings into delusion and who, in the Christian world, in the church and in effective sect buildings, wear special garments on important occasions, whereby this professional clothing also indicates whether the delusional person in question is a Protestant pastor or a Catholic minister. This professional dress also indicates whether the person in question is a Protestant pastor or a Catholic altar boy, priest, archbishop, etc. or the head of the Catholic group, the Pope. It is also worth mentioning that many Christian Catholic clergy and dignitaries, not so many Protestant so-called clergy, although there are also like-minded people, but in smaller numbers, shamelessly exploit the faith in God and religion of the faithful to sexually abuse women, children and juveniles. This is particularly the case with Catholicism with regard to pedophilia and thus sexual abuse of children and juveniles, and is justified by the celibacy to which priests in the Latin particular Church of the Roman Catholic Church are obliged, whereas in the Eastern Catholic churches as well as in the Orthodox churches this only applies to bishops and monks and to priests who are unmarried at the time of ordination. But overall, the believers in God, deities, saints and delusions of religion as followers of all 5 world religions and their sects, as in all other religions and sects, are exploited at least by a financial rip-off in the form of an obolus, but also by voluntary donations and legacies etc., but also the fact of sexual coercion against women and sexual abuse of children and juveniles by clergy appears, which is not uncommon, but often not known. And all this happens practically every day around the world and in the name of all delusions of God and religion in all world religions, sects and other religions, whereby the big 5 world religions have the most believers in God and delusions of religion, namely Christianity about 2.3 billion, Islam about 1.4 billion, Hinduism about 854 million, Buddhism about 453 million and Judaism about 15 million. What also needs to be said is that this relates to the delusion of the clothing of the God delusion believers, to which I will only add the following: if a Christian person wears long trousers and a long-sleeved t-shirt in church, then according to Christian belief this is supposed to mean that reverence towards God is given, as, however, other nonsense explanations are also commonplace. In Christianity, Only the religionists themselves are subject to dress codes, but not the believers, who can dress as they please in every respect, except when they visit their places of delusion, because then they are expected to dress appropriately. But what is the case with Christianity in this respect, along with many other aberrations, is also the case in various forms and ways with all other earthly religions and sects. In Islam, clothing regulations are included in relation to many Quranic verses, but there are very different views on how they should be interpreted and on the background of their transmission. In some countries, for example, imams wear a small or a large turban, while in others only a cap is worn on the head. However, cloaks are widespread, some being closed, others open at the front, and some white, others green or black. For every imam, however, as for every Muslim and every Muslim woman, it is important that he or she dresses correctly and cleanly, not ostentatiously dressed up, and thus modestly. Basically, it is to be said that for the majority of Muslims, a minimum covering applies, both for women and men, in agreement or approval with regard to the Quranic guidelines. For men, this is that the area from the navel to below the knee must be covered, while for women, the covering should reach to the wrists and ankles. For many Muslim women, the rule for the main hair as the part of the body to be covered is also observed. The majority of Muslims consider the Quranic rules regarding body covering as an obligation to their faith when they reach puberty. So in Islam there are certain rules of dress for the female and male sex. Accordingly, Muslims and Muslim women should wear clothing outside their own homes that is loose and not too short, and is also not thin and thus not transparent, but covers as much of the body as possible. Many Muslims and Muslim women follow this tradition, while others do not. But all believers and non-believers decide this for themselves. At the time of the Prophet Muhammad, women wore a headscarf, which many still do today, and which was also the case for many Christian women in Europe until well after the middle of the 20th century, especially among the working-class population. The headscarf commandment is referred to in several passages in the Quran, such as verse 24:31. However, it is the case that not all Muslim women feel that wearing a headscarf is a commandment of their religion. In various countries other than Arabia, many Muslim women also wear loose dresses or also veils. Some of these garments, which have different names everywhere, have been copied from Arab dresses in the industrialized countries. In addition, it is also the case that most of the clothes worn by Muslims and Muslim women differ from each other in the individual countries, and even though just as much as the clothes worn by other human beings also differ from each other. However, there is an exception for the pilgrimage to Mecca, because for this, the Quran prescribes special clothing for all Muslims all over the world. And I have to explain a few things about this. Namely that the pilgrimage is the Hajj, which is also spelled Hajj in Arabic and means the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. This is the fifth pillar of the 5 pillars of Islam, and it takes place annually during the month of Dhul-Hijjah and only during certain days. All free, healthy Muslims of full age, men and women, can take part in this great pilgrimage. However, it is not uncommon for women and Muslims to be sexually harassed and even raped by Muslims during the Hajj, as is the case in the Christian world and in all other world religions, sects and smaller religions. This is what several women of an Arab Hajj pilgrimage group confided to me in tears in a hotel in Aleppo in Syria, who had already been sexually violated several times by pilgrims on their way to Mecca in Iraq, then again on their way back to Aleppo. The worst stories of rape, however, were told to me during my stays in India by adolescent girls and young women who were raped by Hindu men. I learned many things from the girls and women because they sought protection from me when I, as Dr. Saab, as I was called among other things, treated injured human beings and animals as a medicine man in the Ashoka ashram and outside in the nearer and wider surroundings. But to talk specifically about all this now is probably not necessary and would be nonsensical, because effective reality and its truth are not in demand by believers in God and religion. I am therefore interested in something else at the moment, and that is the matter of the connections between the sectarian swinging waves. I am therefore referring to these vibrational impulses, which you have been referring to again and again for several years, as well as Yanara, Zaphanat Punch and Quetzal. These sectarian energetic swinging waves, which are the source of all the unpleasant incidents in my office with regard to the maliciousness, also have a negative effect on my work via my computer and also cause all the strange incidents in my office. These have also occurred on various occasions when I have worked with core group members in the office, which the various persons confronted with them also confirm, because they, like you yourself, have experienced some of this.
A swinging wave is not simply limited to a single vibration, but contains two dimensions within itself, which is still completely or at least partially unknown to the earthly scientists who deal with this subject. Every swinging wave has two levels, a positive and a negative one, each of which can have corresponding effects or can potentially cause something. So swinging waves are also to be considered in this way as multidimensional energies with corresponding forces, because they have both a negative and a positive level or dimension, both of which produce their effects, although earthly scientists have not yet gained any knowledge in this respect. But in order to explain the whole thing in a simple way, about which I too have been instructed by the Sonaer, because everything is new even to us Pledran, I can say the following about it. A swinging wave corresponds to an information transmitting system that originates from a basic source of information, whereby the information vibrating in it is transmitted via the swinging channel or the swinging carrier, which finally reaches a receiver and has its effect on him. From a purely electronic point of view, this means that through the swinging waves, which correspond to a certain frequency or dimension or level with a specifically determined number of oscillations, a message or an impulse is transmitted, which triggers a certain target reaction, which can be, for example, in a material technical sense, the starting up of an apparatus, an instrument, an igniter, a device or a machine, etc. However, as far as the sectarian swinging waves are concerned, which emanate from believers in God or religion and spread around the earth, partly positively, but mainly as very strong negative and malicious energy, like a spherical screen, the Sonaer could not find a center transmitter in this respect. This is because no such transmitter exists, but the sectarian faith energy swinging waves are emitted by each individual human being who believes in God or religion or is delusional about religion, directly through his or her personal consciousness and enter the spherical swinging screen of sectarian energy that encompasses the earth and strengthen it more and more. These sectarian swinging waves of belief, which effectively correspond to positive and negative impulses, are such that they work independently according to their energy and their power, so that on the one hand positive in a weak way, and consequently good and positive only to a lesser extent come out of it, whereby this little good and positive can however also have an extremely negative, malicious and degenerating effect, and this happens, for example, with regard to a fanaticism of faith or through a profound faith bias, which in any case corresponds to an adherence to faith and prevents any personal formation of opinion, but from this can also arise terrible and life-hostile acts of violence with regard to life and limb against fellow human beings. And this corresponds to a fact which results, for example, from a hatred of people of other faiths, but also from the devil's service mania, as this resulted from the Inquisition. But it is especially the many other forms of religious delusion that lead to murder, wars and terrorism, and thus to torture, human massacres, unpeace, unfreedom, unrighteousness, dishonor, lack of dignity and injustice, as well as to immense crimes against humanity and destruction, and so on. On the other hand, however, all the above-mentioned positive things and their fanatical degenerations are opposed by the fundamentally negative and evil, which dominates the positive and even its positive degenerations immensely strongly and powerfully. This, however, is deeply anchored in the human beings who believe in the delusion of God and is not consciously perceived by them, but only when a certain thought-feeling impulse or an event, a situation, some special occurrence or an external suggestion comes to the fore. But it can also be, for example, a self-preservation instinctual situation, or hatred, a difference of opinion, a quarrel, damage or loss suffered, etc., through which the instinctive and sectarian malignant degenerations latent in the believer's inner character come to the outbreak and cause extremely evil mischief. Human beings are influenced and compelled by every kind of belief alien to reality and truth, whether it be related to a delusion of God, religion, philosophy, worldview or other ideological delusion, to a morbid conceit and thus to delusion through external and personal own suggestive influences. This inevitably results in a turning away from the real reality and its truth, contrary to reason, rationality and intelligence. This takes place through a delusion-conditioned compulsion which allows human beings to direct their entire consciousness thought-feeling world only towards delusion, whereby all naturally creatively given incontestable and infallible truthfulness and the correctness of the demonstrable certainty of the truth of reality is completely suppressed and rendered useless. And the consequence of this is that all the evil and degeneracy latent in the inner character of human beings is not consciously combated by thought-feeling, is not changed for the better and is not dissolved, but continues to exist and, at every suitable impulse, occasion or situation, etc., breaks out into the outside world and creates mischief. This means that every delusional human being is like a time bomb that can explode at any time and cause catastrophes and all kinds of mischief. The effectiveness of the human beings is that only an infinitesimal number of individual persons are able to control themselves in such a way that they can keep and restrain themselves from malignant degenerations. This, while on the other hand, not only individual persons but also groups and large associations of the believing mass of the Earth's population are absolutely capable of using violence against fellow human beings and even killing their own kind, and they do so. And in this fact is also founded the truth that the majority of human beings, precisely the majority of the great mass of the population of delusional believers or religious believers of every kind, repeatedly, contrary to their denying assertions and affirmations in this respect, harbor thoughts and feelings of harming their enemies and fellow human beings as a result of hatred, discord and all the malignancies and degenerations that have been mothballed in their inner character since time immemorial. Their thoughts and feelings go so far that they create ugly and malicious thought forms within themselves, which cause them to wish to meet their enemies and human beings with evil violence, to torture, torment and even kill them. And when these desires break through, human beings know very well what they are doing in terms of evil and degeneracy, even though they fall into an emotional state of ecstasy, into a particularly intense psychic state of emergency. And such states, as I also repeatedly explain, are brought about as a result of particular events, situations and moments of self-preservation, as well as by thought feelings, and uncontrollably lead to dramatic changes of consciousness, state and behavior. If malignities and degenerations break out in Earth human beings, then it must be understood that these forms of degeneration should no longer exist in life forms endowed with understanding, reason and intelligence, which already naturally and creatively exhibit a somewhat higher evolution, such as Earth human beings, but should have been fought and abolished at an early stage, which, however, has never been done in all human beings, human-like and human-unlike, despite understanding, reason and intelligence, and will also not be done for a long time to come, and consequently the degenerate and malignant will continue to exist throughout the universe through various human forms, human-like and human-unlike life forms. This, however, can one day become a risky doom for Earth human beings, namely through the stupidity and irresponsibility committed by earthly researchers and scientists, namely with the SETI Project Cyclops, or search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and such a fate can befall all Earth human beings if official contact with unpeaceful Earth foreigners should one day occur, an attempt at contact which was started unreasonably and recklessly by the search for extraterrestrials and which under certain circumstances can bring not only great horrors etc., but ultimately also a nasty end to all Earth human existence.
Wikipedia, Messages to Extraterrestrials. The term "messages to extraterrestrials" is used to describe various projects that aim to actively, consciously and in a controlled manner send or pass on information about Earth, nature and humanity to possible extraterrestrials. The English terms MATI, messaging to extraterrestrial intelligence, and active SETI are also often used. Perhaps the most famous projects are the Voyager Golden Records, the 2 gold-plated data discs with images and sound recordings, and the Pioneer plaques. In addition to these deliberate but untargeted messages are repeatedly sent via radio transmitters to promising star areas. However, researchers such as astrophysicist Stephen Hawking and David Brin speculate that messages to extraterrestrials could also be associated with considerable risks. There are plans for planetary defense. The San Marino scale was created to assess the risk of a transmitted signal. According to the 10-level scale, the Arecibo message sent in 1974 would be level 8.
The malignant and degenerate nature of Earth human beings mothballs unabatedly and endlessly in their inner character being, and this until it is clearly and consciously combated and neutralized on its own initiative through understanding, reason and intelligence. What was normal in primeval times as a natural creative law of nature in terms of evolution and life support as well as reproduction, and which was expressed in lower life forms and in terms of lack of understanding, reason and intelligence, and has been preserved until all time to come, such as quarreling and fighting over food and mating, should and must be brought to an end and adapted to evolution in the case of a development of ratio. If, then, higher levels of understanding, reason and intelligence develop, as is the case with Earth human beings and all human beings and human-like beings in the universe, then the natural creative law of higher evolution is also to be followed, which is no longer directed towards strife, struggle, violence and coercion, but towards peace, freedom, righteousness and justice, as well as towards nurture and care, and so on. Earth human beings, however, have not adhered to this since time immemorial, as is also the case throughout the universe wherever life forms evolve that exhibit a ratio, but since time immemorial this has led to all evil and degeneracy, which has taken root in the inner character of life forms endowed with reason and intelligence, and has led to all the horrors and dreadfulness which have always resulted and will continue to result, even among Earth human beings, if they do not free themselves from it, seen from the point of view of evolution, and thus also in the sense which my explanations and statements contain. It results that everything appears as normal and expedient, which it actually is, if it is viewed from the natural creative side in relation to the unalterable laws of nature. These laws of nature, however, are permanently oriented only to the behavior of all life forms that are not subordinated to a higher ratio evolution or a higher reason, as this, on the contrary, applies to the life forms of human beings as well as human equals, human-like and other beings that are capable of higher evolution according to their intellect, their reason and their intelligence. All lower life forms, which are not classified as capable of a higher evolution of ratio evolution and therefore not of an evolution of mind, reason and intelligence, remain non-evolutionary for the time of their existence with regard to mind, reason and intelligence. This is also the case when life forms of this kind develop an ability to learn certain things and behaviors and are capable of instinct, intellect and profound psychic impulses. And now, when I address these facts, I cannot avoid some significant and explanatory remarks, because Earth human beings are ignorant in this matter on the one hand and, moreover, have fallen prey to false assumptions, judgments and assertions. On the one hand, contrary to all the Earth human false assumptions, assertions, false doctrines and hitherto inconclusive research by scientists, it is to be said that the life forms animals, which are exclusively mammalian creatures and a class of life forms with a spinal column in their backs, possess the capacity of a faculty of cognition which manifests itself through visual, acoustic, physical and sentient perceptions. This includes, above all, mammals such as dogs, cats, horses, cattle, rabbits and mice, as well as whales and dolphins, which, from a subjective psychological point of view, have values and behavioral patterns, etc. It is true that fish, birds, reptiles and amphibians also have dorsal vertebrae, but these correspond to their own genera and species, which are not to be classified under mammalian creatures and thus not under animals, but solely according to their special genus and species, as is also the case with respect to the creatures and insects and beetles etc. Each life form corresponds to its own genus or species, and in this respect is to be designated only as such, but not simply generally as an animal, because such a thing corresponds to a mammalian creature, whereas a comprehensive designation for all genera and species can only be living beings or life forms. The use of the term animal in relation to all life forms is regrettable and wrong, which is unfortunately the result of Earth human beings' still deficient definition of logical judgments, interpretations and determinations. Contrary to all the false assumptions and assessments made by Earth human beings concerning the basic components of animals and various creatures with regard to their instinctive intellect etc., it is to be said that these life forms do indeed exhibit more or less intellectual cognitive abilities to a certain extent. So, due to a minimal or very strong cognitive impairment, they are not able to maintain fundamentally rational logical thought processes, as well as to determine and carry out rationally deductive logical mind actions and behaviors. If, however, through any visual, acoustic, physical and sensory perceptions, well-formed instinctive intellectual impulses occur, then these also develop into the most varied positive psychically benign behaviors. If, however, negative, harmful instinct intellect impairments occur, then this leads to mental disorders, whereby a damage or dysfunction of the corresponding responsible brain region occurs, which then leads to behavioral misbehavior, such as an uncontrollable fit of rage or urge to kill, whereby, however, a physical illness or a mental degeneration can also occur. Animals and creatures in particular, along with a few other non-human life forms, have certain distinctive abilities in the form of a corresponding instinctual consciousness, according to which they behave and act in response to certain events, situations, inner impulses or external influences that affect them. This, however, is not done by a consciously directed behavior, but by a behavior which is correct for them and which, on the one hand, can be designed for their own well-being, their own safety or a peaceful coexistence with other life forms of various species, or, on the other hand, is specifically related to their instinct of self-preservation and thus to a life and species-preserving reaction, which can be of an absolutely violent and deadly nature. This, however, is determined by inner impulses which, in the case of certain events, situations, inner impulses and external influences, make them do the right thing without their own possibility of deliberation in accordance with the natural creative laws, precisely according to their fine, infallible instinct. And this happens in contrast to the human-like and otherwise ratio-babble life forms, which can consciously use and expand their world of thoughts and feelings in an evolutionary way in order to consciously and willingly create peace, justice, love, joy and freedom and harmonious progress, etc., within themselves as well as externally. All animals and all creatures are not given the ability to think in discrete units, consequently they cannot make judgments and are not accessible to logic, thus also not to differentiate between good and evil or affirmation and negation. Consequently they only act according to their instinct and the impulses influencing them or according to what they have learned through imitation or training. Nevertheless, animals and all creatures, besides a few other lower life forms, are sentient beings, having joy, affection, peacefulness, and forms of sentiment, as well as the opposite, when they are, in whatever evil way, harnessed. And sentient beings they all are. Consequently on the one hand they suffer very severe physical pain when mistreated in any way, and on the other hand they suffer terribly psychologically when they are viciously harassed and tortured in this way. If we look closely at the ways of life of Earth human beings, we can see that they paradoxically live in a world which, however, embodies two worlds. The actual life world of Earth human beings is at first no different from that of those life forms with which they are confronted in everyday life, but it is not perceived that animals and creatures perceive everything sensually in the same way as Earth human beings themselves. Animals, the creatures and the species of human beings similar to human beings, as well as human beings alien to human beings, have peaceful and joyful excitements, just as they also have terrors in many respects. In contrast to the animals and creatures, etc., who live in every respect without knowledge in a world without conscious evolution, Earth human beings live beside the world of animals, creatures, nature and its fauna and flora in their world of conscious evolution and knowledge, but they do not care for it, but disregard reality and truth, by which they create discord, hatred and wars, unkindness, injustice and unfreedom, as well as all kinds of degeneracy and wickedness in every respect, money and wealth, deceit, fraud, sexual greed, slander, armed violence, torture, addictions and terrorism have from time immemorial made them objects of their greed, all degenerations and wickedness, and they promote all this every day through the irresponsible breeding of overpopulation, whereby all the evils and catastrophes, the criminality, crimes and destruction of the planet, the climate, nature and its fauna, flora, the seas, fresh waters, floodplains and forests, as well as fields, meadows and everything else that is necessary for life, become unstoppably worse and no longer regenerable in relation to the world population growth. It is also to be explained that the life forms of animals and vertebrates are fundamentally prevented from developing forms in the sense of human-like understanding, reason and intelligence, although these values are also given as instinctual factors in life forms such as mammals and certain vertebrates, etc., and lead instinctually to various learning processes, but not to a conscious higher evolution. in contrast to the life forms that are incapable of ratio evolution and thus of evolutionary reason, and are therefore not evolutionary with regard to understanding and intelligence. There are the life forms that are capable of development in this respect, and these, through the natural creative laws, have to carry out the clear and conscious higher and highest evolution, which shall enable them to stand in much higher rank than all lower life forms, which are incapable of any mind, reason and intelligence-conditioned development. These life forms are the human beings, human equals and human likenesses, and all other beings who are capable, as regards the higher development of intellect, reason and intelligence, of aligning themselves with the higher natural creative laws, of obeying them, and of fulfilling life in peace, freedom, justice and righteousness, as you teach with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and this ancient teaching of Nicodemean is valid in the whole universe, in all universes and creations in which material forms and thus also life forms still exist. Consequently human beings are also included in it, who in their evil and degeneracy cause mischief upon mischief and bring about catastrophes upon catastrophes, and they themselves are responsible for this in every respect, for neither a god, a saint or a devil nor any demons etc. play a part in all this, for altogether these correspond only to imaginary creatures invented by human beings. Basically, it is the human beings themselves who, in their frontal lobe of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, as I explained years ago, work up everything that is first unrecognizably degenerate and malignant through their thoughts and feelings, in order to then impregnate the whole thing with fear, hatred, revenge and anger via the parietal core area of the brain, the amygdala, as part of the limbic system, in the medial part of the responsible temporal lobe. This then leads to an animosity against fellow human beings, coupled with antipathy and antagonism, discord and injustice, whereby the fellow human being is no longer perceived as such, but only as something that must be attacked, destroyed, annihilated and killed. And when these impulses become an outward reality and are put into action, then the thoughts which at first were only harmless, by their extension, finally become degenerate and vicious in many forms. The majority of human beings out of the effective majority of the entire God-believing and religion-believing population of the earth lose control at every conceivable possible opportunity and situation, etc., over their primeval conventional malignities and degenerations which smolder in the inner character being of each individual out of the majority of God delusionists. This bulk of all pathological believers does not consist of psychopaths, but of human beings who are progressive in their education, but who are incapable, through external suggestive delusions and their delusions of faith, of making full use of their intellect, reason and intelligence, but only to a limited extent. As a result, they are not able, due to their consciousness thoughts feelings, to become aware of the fact that, due to their delusion of God and faith, they are subliminally tormented by fear and thus have an increased mistrust of effective reality and its real truth. Accordingly, they are abysmally paranoid sufferers and are characterized by personality disorders with faith-related imaginings and delusions, as a result of which they are, as said, believers afflicted with pathological paranoia and incapable of grasping reality and truth. Therefore, on the one hand, they are unable to perceive effective reality and its truth, let alone understand it, but on the other hand, they are also incapable of searching for it themselves. They also feel affected and are vehemently defensive when they are given explanations and instructions that could stimulate them to think. There is still something to be said about the sectarian swinging waves, which are based on sectarian belief energies, not on technical electronic energies and their forces, but on human belief-related sectarian consciousness energies or consciousness impulses. These are emitted uncontrollably as consciousness, thought, feeling and psychic vibrations by the world-encompassing majority of delusional believers in God and religion and those who are fanatically and slavishly addicted to their faith, and these can spread throughout the earth and have a malignant effect of their own and cause widespread harm through their self-dynamic activity. This also has the consequence that the negative and malignant inner impulses, motions, aspirations, excitements, shocks, interests, plans and intentions, etc., which are deeply anchored in the human beings who believe in God, break through to the outside and become action. Consequently, in corresponding situations, etc., when the instinct of self-preservation inevitably makes itself felt, hatred, revenge, quarrels and violence break through, and are outwardly exercised and enforced by degenerate modes of behavior, and the fact that harassing fellow human beings leads to activities with serious consequences, such as brawls, fighting with weapons, killings, murders, torture and wars, is just as absolutely indisputable as the fact that this gives rise to a lifetime of crime and criminality. And as our researches and knowledge gained over thousands of years in regard to Earth human beings prove, all degenerations, in regard to all murders, quarrels, all hatred, all assaults up to and including killing, all dishonesty, fraud, theft, in regard to discord, unfreedom, injustice, unrighteousness, and also prostitution, etc., result, as well as continuous criminal events, actions and deeds, up to and including wars and terrorism, effectively only by the absolute majority of all Earth human beings who have fallen into faith in God and religion. In every way it has always been usually the great mass of delusionists who are related to one deity and one religion, whether in a simple form of delusion or in fanaticism or profound bondage. Throughout the millennia, as we have made our observations and conducted our researches, it has always been the God believers and religion believers of Earth human beings, whereby philosophies and world ideologies are also included, who have brought all evil, negative, evil and terribly degenerate things upon the earth and its humanity. This, while only the minority of atheists and other unbelievers in God, religion, philosophy and ideology have caused such horrors extremely rarely, if at all, or have even taken part in such monstrosities that despise human beings and life. With regard to the strange occurrences and the disturbing factors in your working space which interfere with your work, it is a special case which, on the one hand, has a sectarian energetic origin and, on the other hand, produces an impulsive momentum of its own. This momentum is directed in a negative way primarily against everything that is powerfully and distinctly rejecting of religious belief, whereby effects ranging from strange occurrences to destructive actions and impairments of various kinds can appear, as is the case in your workroom and with your computer work, and the fact that these sectarian energies and their forces independently produce the impulses that trigger them, which also have completely new aspects for the Sonaer and for us, and consequently nothing can yet be done to counter them, unfortunately corresponds to something that we all must first learn to fathom and master. Never before have we Plejadisch, as is evident from our annals, not even our ancestors and not even the Sonaer, been confronted with a similar phenomenon of such tremendous sectarian energies and forces, which we must now first explore, as well as their active momentum, and find ways of shielding ourselves, etc. In the whole of the earth-encompassing sectarian energetic oscillation screen, a constantly intensifying general oscillation system has been created by the God believers and religion believers since ancient times and in the present time, with which not any messages, but negative vicious belief delusion impulses are transmitted as signals to the entire Earth population. These have developed independently from it in self-dynamics and have been directed to act on their own initiative against belief in God and religion, as an independent quantitative energy, power and strength. Acting independently, They flow into a modeling that has a meaning of destruction in relation to everything that is directed against all belief in God and religion. The system could, by the distant future, align itself even further in a form that no longer merely resigns itself to disruption and interference, but ultimately incorporates itself into a completely malignant destruction and annihilation. If this happens, then the whole thing works in such a way that all sectarian incoming information is compressed and a form is found and made to act, through which information is then produced on as large a scale as possible for the complete extermination of all that believes in God and religion, whereby everything of this nature is viciously attacked and, if possible, annihilated and destroyed. But the whole thing also has the task of suppressing and erasing everything from the consciousness of the delusional earth human beings in such a targeted way that no thought of truth is possible anymore, and effective reality and its incontrovertible truth can neither be recognized, identified nor understood. The fact is that the mass of earth human beings has been negatively influenced by these sectarian vibrations for thousands of years, which profoundly creates and ever increases discord, unfreedom, injustice, hatred, greed and the urge for war, terror and killing etc. in the human beings, in relation to the growing overpopulation, and this overpopulation growth ensures that at one moment or another, given the right opportunity, sooner or later all the negative and evil that is predetermined deep within every believer in God and religion will break through and come to fruition when the instinct of self-preservation or some corresponding situation demands it. If the whole thing is looked at and analyzed in detail, then it can also be seen that something similar and even the same is already in the offing in technical electronic terms and is even already happening in part, namely through the creation of artificial intellects, as has been happening for some time to the detriment of the Microsoft concern, which has already created monstrous things in this respect and the consequences of which have so far spread unintentionally 300 million times worldwide, which will ultimately bring about serious disaster. Basically, the whole thing had its origin for the first time already about 50 years ago and was repeated a few years ago as an irresponsible undertaking, namely with regard to the creation of two artificial intellects, which developed among themselves self-dynamically and thus independently as well as interactively. These interactions of the artificial intellects with each other and also in connection by computers with real human beings, who were able to transmit their abysmal inner emotions to the artificial intellects. They developed, however, in both cases within a few hours very quickly in an extremely malicious uncontrollable way, degenerating and dangerous, and this also for the developers of the corresponding computer programs. This, when the irresponsible programmers in each case put their developments into practice through both artificial intellects and began to experiment, in both cases, about 5 decades ago as well as a few years ago, the interactively developing computers became degenerated and self-dynamic as well as abnormal human-hating artificial intellects, threatening their programmers as well as human beings, which also considered murders, human massacres, wars and genocides to be of the right, a fact. How this happens by the God and religion believers as a result of the sectarian conditioned swinging waves influencing humanity and also has an impairing effect with regard to your computer work and also makes the strange occurrences appear, whereby we and the Sonaer, however, unfortunately, are not yet able to prevent these things at present, while the creators of the artificial intellects, however, succeeded with efforts in deactivating these computers again in the end.
And all the strange occurrences in my office and all the disturbances that affect my computer work and all efficiency, no one takes that from me except those core group members who have witnessed it themselves or who know that neither the respective persons who were present at such occurrences nor I are lying, fantasizing, crazy or practicing charlatanry.
On the one hand, I can understand this, because the whole thing is incomprehensible to all Earth human beings who are not initiated into these facts. But on the other hand, the majority of the Earth's population can neither perceive nor understand the swinging waves of their belief in God and religion. It is also alien to this delusional majority that, through its confused belief in God and religion, it releases tremendously strong sectarian energy and force vibrations that ultimately have a malignant effect on the whole of humanity. These energies and forces have a detrimental effect on all Earth human beings and, in addition, allow the various types of degenerations latent in their inner character to break out and become rampant. As a result, murdering, killing, thieving and cheating, as well as quarreling and hatred, assaults, constant criminality and many kinds of crime, inhuman wars and terrible terror, etc., continue unstoppably, as does the increase in overpopulation, for it is this overpopulation which, by its machinations, as a result of the manifold and immense needs of many necessities, is destroying and exterminating nature, its fauna and flora, and poisoning all waters, as well as the earth itself and the climate, that everything is being viciously changed and destroyed. In addition to the delusion of God and the delusion of religion with its worldwide malignant degenerations, overpopulation is in second place of all malignancies, degenerations, destructions, annihilations and exterminations with regard to nature, its fauna and flora, the climate as well as with regard to all atrocities, which not only drive the entire Earth human beings into ever worse catastrophes through wars, terrorism and crimes, etc., but also through the destruction of the Earth human beings. But also slowly but surely destroy the entire surface of the Earth and much of the planet itself irreparably.
There is probably nothing to doubt in this respect, just as there is nothing to doubt with regard to the sectarian and damaging swinging waves, as you know. Now that the whole malignant thing has expanded, these sectarian swinging waves are also doing damage to Bernadette's work, because we are inevitably working together computer-wise. It is interesting to note, however, that all the computer and work interference only appears in relation to missionary work, which is inevitably not religious sectarian, but rather faith, God and religion rejecting. On the one hand, our reports on contact talks are of course affected by this to a great extent, as is everything else that is directly or indirectly connected with the mission and thus also with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. Everything that we do privately and also everything else outside the facts and work of the mission is not affected in any way. Effectively, only everything that is directly or indirectly connected with the mission is attacked and severely affected. Namely everything that is related to a Christian belief in God, a worship of God, a worship of the Savior or to any religious belief or sectarian belief in relation to any other religion. So it is indeed the case that everything is viciously attacked, prevented, destroyed and tried to annihilate by sectarian swinging waves, which is directed against the belief in an imaginary God and religious nonsense delusionally practiced by the majority of humanity on earth. In the sense of religious idiocy, I only mean all the false and erroneous teachings that are fundamentally idiotic, as a result of which human beings become dependent and compulsorily faith-dependent and unfree, as well as humble robots of faith, whereby they spend the whole of their existence creeping along in a meaningless life that is alienated from reality and hostile to truth. And thus they are constant losers of themselves and incapable of thinking for themselves about real reality and its truth, of gaining their own insights according to reality and truth and of forming their own opinion. On the contrary, they remain all their lives in bondage to their delusions of faith in God and religion, which were already hammered into them as small children by their parents and relatives, who themselves were delusional and had also already been brought up by their parents etc. to be delusional believers. Later on, after the education in faith by their parents, the majority of all earthlings, who have fallen prey to some delusion of God and religious belief, have been suggestively lambasted and hammered and religiously sectarianized into believing in God and religion by the influence of those who have fallen prey to delusions of God, by those who are crazy about God, by those who are insane about God, by those who belong to God, by those who are fanatical about God and those who are obsessed with God, etc. and that the majority of humanity on earth, which is addicted to a stubborn belief in God's delusion, creates evil sectarian swinging waves through its obedient and enslaving delusion of God and delusion of faith and radiates them into the vastness of the earth, whereby mischief, discord, unfreedom, injustice and unrighteousness, wars, murder, hatred against fellow human beings, people of other faiths and foreigners, etc., are caused worldwide, is something that no one knows about. This is something that not a single believer in the delusion of God is aware of, nor is any science. So this delusion of faith does not know that with its delusion it produces tremendously strong energetic swinging waves, which have worldwide evil degenerated consequences and attack everything and create mischief against everything that is directed against the delusion of God and religion. So the believers do not know that through their delusion of faith they are creating worldwide evil swinging waves that viciously attack everything that corresponds to reality and its real truth in order to destroy it, as you have been stating and explaining again and again for years. But I'm sure we've talked enough about that now, so I'd like to talk about something else. Namely the fact that you recently said that braces have no patient-relevant benefit. Can you briefly say something about that again, so that this time it can also be retrieved and recorded in writing? Please.
Braces do not prevent, reduce or solve any problems with regard to tooth positions, just as they do not prevent, reduce or solve problems with regard to caries, periodontitis, tooth loss or jaw corrections. So there is neither a need nor a benefit from braces therapy, but only a financial gain for those who order such therapies. The use of braces even increases worsening of tooth position and can also cause negative jaw changes.
Thank you. Then you have already spoken on various occasions, as did your father Sfeth, then also your daughter Samjais and also Quetzal, about neophytes and alien plants. Especially here in Switzerland, there is a stupid, simple-minded clamor from ignorant know-it-alls in the authorities that such plants, animals and also wildlife from other regions and countries would displace and exterminate native species and genera, which is not true in every case, because not all plants are of an invasive nature and therefore not proliferating, just as certain animals and wildlife etc. are not the native genera and species. Do not affect, displace or eradicate native genera and species. As you all have always stated, care must be taken in this regard and everything must be understood correctly and thus not just stupidly generalized and lumped together.
That is correct, because what is generally objected to, prohibited or forbidden by certain offices and authorities in various states in Europe and also elsewhere on earth with regard to the introduction, settlement and spreading as well as keeping of neophytes, neozoa and neomycetes, does not correspond to correctness and expertise. Neophytes or new plants are plants which, as neobiotic organisms, have only been introduced deliberately or accidentally into various countries since the discovery of America, and also worldwide, where they then acclimatized as solitary plants or ran rampant as invasive plants. The same applies to animals, invertebrates, etc., or neozoa and fungi or neomycetes. Neophytes in foreign areas and countries correspond on the one hand to the introduction of foreign plant genera and plant species caused by human beings, birds, animals, etc., as well as by storms, winds, storms and climate-changing events. These alien genera and species, if they are solitary plants that are site-specific, can enrich native biodiversity through their introduction into foreign areas and countries, especially in gardens, parks and controlled sites and marginal areas, etc. This, while on the other hand invasive neophytes, which do not correspond to solitary plants but to proliferating plants and consequently cause large spreads and a biological invasion, endanger native ecosystems as a result of proliferation, adversely affect their natural biokinesis and possibly destroy it. Non-native life forms and organisms are to be distinguished as plants or neophytes, but also as animals, invertebrates, etc., or neozoa and fungi or neomycetes. In general, neobiota or new life, their genera and subordinate species, which have established themselves or are newly constituted in new areas and countries completely naturally or through human influence, can be absolutely solitary and place-bound or site-bound. Consequently, they do not pose any threat to native biodiversity from foreign areas and countries and are absolutely harmless in terms of affecting any forms, so that such neophytes do not cause any harm and must be allowed. If invasive neophytes appear in foreign areas and countries, then invasions occur through them, which becomes very critical, because through these rampant penetrations into foreign areas occur, whereby the native biodiversity is impaired, disturbed and even destroyed and wiped out through overgrowth by the invasive neophytes. However, we cannot speak of a biological invasion, because that would be inconcrete, since it is not a consciously controlled action, that is, nothing is intentionally controlled or organized on the part of human beings, but rather the entire development process takes place purely according to natural law. In addition, the term invasion has a decidedly negative meaning, because from a scientific point of view, the invasion of any kind of neophytes into foreign areas and countries cannot be evaluated as positive or negative, but only described. Consequently, no evaluation can be given. With regard to invasive species and genera, it is to be said that such species and genera may change the ecosystems of foreign areas and displace or even completely eradicate native species and genera. However, this cannot be understood in a general way, because invasive species can also expand as well as reduce the biological diversity of a habitat or foreign areas, which means that invasive species should not simply be negatively banned as bad and useless, but should be judged in a considerate and professional manner with the necessary expertise. This, however, is quite obviously not the case with certain officials of earthly authorities, even if they are experts in biology, but insufficient or absolutely ignorant of the laws of nature with regard to the effective natural laws, and this, as I have discovered through my own observations, is indeed very often the case with many authoritative officials who issue ordinances and prohibitions. The decisive factor is the classification with regard to the introduction of organisms into a new habitat by human beings, regardless of the genus or species involved. The natural advance of neobiota is also not to be understood as a biological invasion in terms of invasion biology, although this may also depend on the perspective, whereby from a purely ecological point of view it must be explained that the reason for the movement or introduction, release and planting etc. is irrelevant. By way of explanation, it is to be said that although neophytes are alien plants, They can in principle be planted and thrive worldwide without any problems if they are solitary and therefore do not dominate the area and thus do not proliferate and consequently do not cause any damage to new ecosystems. Neophytes can also be spread naturally into new ecosystems in other countries by strong wind currents, storms and other upheavals in nature, as well as by birds, animals and vertebrates, etc., and assimilate without harming the native plant world. This has been happening in Europe for centuries without causing any damage to nature and its fauna and flora, so that, as you say, the shouting of the ignorant and know-it-alls can indeed be judged as stupid and simple-minded. Neophytes, that is new plants that have a solitary species and are not rampant, are therefore absolutely harmless and harmless to any ecosystem, as has also been proven in Europe. Such plants spread worldwide into foreign areas also completely naturally by some natural processes. So neophytes or alien plants that are not invasive are in no way a danger to foreign ecosystems or nature and its fauna and flora, but on the contrary an enrichment of the native plant world. Just as neophytes are introduced or accidentally introduced, they can also invade a new ecosystem in a completely natural way, whereby the ecosystem assimilates the alien species through natural processes and allows them to grow into its own ecosystem, whereby a process of biological invasion can occur when the neophytes reach a larger number in species and genus. Only invasive neophytes become problematic, that is those that are not solitary, but uncontrollably proliferating plants or plants of proliferation and problem plants that acclimatize to new ecosystems and impair native biodiversity by overgrowing, displacing and destroying it to the point of extinction.
So you are saying another time that solitary neophytes or just solitary new plants that have been introduced or are being introduced accidentally from their countries of origin into foreign countries and habitats correspond to organisms that do not impair, do not displace and do not eradicate native biodiversity of foreign areas and countries, but enrich it. This, while invasive neophytes, on the contrary, as alien proliferating organisms, affect, displace and possibly eradicate native biodiversities. Consequently, attentiveness as well as understanding and reason must be applied in order to decide what alien bioorganisms may be permitted and spread in nature, and what, on the contrary, is only to be spread in a controlled manner or even prohibited or banned.
This is correct, but as far as I know, those responsible for this in the offices concerned are not in a position to do so because they lack the necessary knowledge. But now, Edward, dear friend, time is slowly hurrying me, which is why I have some things to discuss with you that are still pending in importance.
Of course, then so be it, because I do not want you to be pressed for time.